The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tyler, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time watch-along podcast. That's right, I had to change my intro by one word because it turns out that we're talking about a television show today rather than a book. Greg, we had a big watch party at your house, and I don't know how much of this television show you actually absorbed because I was mostly paying attention to the jokes in the row of chairs behind you. How confident do you feel that you can actually talk about this for about an hour?
A lifetime full of Muppet viewing has made me accustomed to Statler and Waldorf sitting behind me, joking up in the balcony, and honing in on this. Actually, in all reality, it's teaching that's done it, right? Where you have to somehow continue with your lesson, even though, yes, the TikTok your student is looking at looks way more entertaining than the words coming out of your mouth, and you'd rather talk about that. So I feel somewhat prepared. I think, it's really exciting to be talking about the show again. Behind the scenes, the way we worked this is Tyler watched the show as it aired because literally nothing could stop him. And the plan and we did execute it was that he would watch the whole thing, kind of make sure that the experience wouldn't in any way jeopardize the enjoyment of the books. We're not even sure what exactly would constitute that, but we played it safe. And then once he finished the season and gave the all clear, we were free to record these episodes. And, we had a good response to the TV show episodes for season 1. And I think we're excited to put together this batch of episodes. So like last season of the television season of the sub show of the podcast that's about books, what we did is we did these in 2 episode batches, kind of akin to when we do 2 chapters, which is the majority of our episodes. Yeah. So tonight we will be talking about season 2, episode 1 and season 2, episode 2. And Tyler, you were responsible and wrote down the names of those episodes.
That is incorrect. I am never responsible. I never write things down. We are going to continue the pattern that we established in the previous set of special television episodes. We did not prepare with the rigor that we usually do for this podcast, and I am very okay with that. We are discussing a couple of episodes of TV. There's a lot of things to cover, and if we don't get to it all, oh well, go watch the show again. That's the best part of this podcast. You can just keep enjoying the media over and over and over again. Greg, I am curious. Excuse me.
No. Before, don't get down to business. I know when you switch to business voice, Tyler. So my last thing to say for preamble is, of course, our spoiler policy for these episodes. So when you are listening to this, you should be aware that we will talk as much as possible purely about the television show and do our best not to spoil beyond the television episodes we're discussing or beyond the section of this book that we are discussing. So season 2 is roughly equivalent to The Great Hunt. And so while we will try to leave
Season 2 is roughly equivalent to The Great Hunt and significant parts of the following book, which is called The Dragon Reborn.
So we will do our best to just stick to television material. But if you are very spoiler phobic and you saw these episodes dropped and you are somewhere back in our back catalog and don't want to hear this yet, then again, like Tyler said, we'll be here. Just set us aside. Go ahead and wait till after book 3 or later, and you will be entirely safe to do this. But we were just talking before airing that it seems like reductive and silly to spend too much time comparing the two. And so we're going to just try to treat this as an analysis of the 2 episodes of television on its own terms. But any potential spoilerific material we'll try to, make a noise about. So that is all my preamble. Tyler, to business.
So I think your preamble is exactly right. And I want to carve out maybe 2-3 minutes at the beginning of this conversation to do what you just said we wouldn't do. Right. I think in general, wow, I want to spend our time talking about what happened on screen, what was going on. But I just want to give you a couple of minutes to talk about what you thought about the adaptation. Right. This is a season of television, or at least 2 episodes of television you've seen so far that are based on a book you've read and have a lot of differences from the book you've read, right? I think going forward, the plan is exactly right. Let's not talk about how similar or different it is. But if we've got 5 minutes, what were your thoughts on this second season? Because I know throughout the first, we spent a lot of time saying it's similar, but here are the differences. What is that going to change down the line? And I'm curious where you're at in terms of, is this still a faithful adaptation, or have we reached the point where it's just like a completely different story in your mind?
Yeah, it's certainly a good question. The question of adaptation and what people's preferences are is always really interesting to me. I'm trying to think of the right personal analogy. Like 3 summers ago, maybe 2 summers ago, Weezer was asked to cover Toto's Africa.
Oh, we talked about
they
this,
did
yes.
so obligingly, and essentially it was just Weezer playing the exact version of Toto's Africa that you've heard. Yeah. And I'm not the biggest Weezer fan. I'm not a fan, but I was like, this seems kind of pointless. More recently, I've been buying some Star Wars comics, and it's an adaptation of the hit television show The Mandalorian. Yeah. And I pick up a new issue. I'm like, oh, great, the new Mandalorian's out. And then I get like 2 pages in, and I'm like, oh, right, this is just exactly the show. Like, they don't change the dialogue. They don't really change the art or the shots. Like, they do minimal adapting. And basically every issue, I'm like, why did I buy this? And then I forget. And a month later, I buy the next issue. And so this is my way of saying I don't like adaptation that is incredibly faithful. If you are adapting, I think you have to recognize that there are differences between mediums, if you prefer, and that you have to embrace those. So and this is funny because during the watch party, this work came up. I am not. We were reminded that we're both a fan of the David Mitchell book, Cloud Atlas, which is like A+ phenomenal book, and then an okay movie. And as an adaptation process, it's really interesting. And so while I will not say that particular final product is perfect, the Wachowski sisters, when they were discussing the process, I remember specifically they said that they essentially they talked about it like a Lego set. They took the novel as a Lego set, they smashed it to bits and built what they wanted from those same pieces. And I think that to me is now how I'm feeling about this adaptation. Man, that was like a really long walk to get to the answer to your question. But that's how I'm feeling about this adaptation, that I need to be aware that it's going to have a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. I have not seen anything yet that is like, oh, here's Rand's little brother, Stand, who's also a prophetic master one. So there's been nothing that kind of transgressed to the extent that, would offend me. So I'm okay with that, because to me, the point of an adaptation is to honor the spirit, honor the experience you had. But there's no reason to replicate it, because if you want the book experience, the books are there, they're available. So, and we could talk some specifics that were already revealed these episodes, but we'll leave it kind of broad per our conversation before.
Well, and I really like that example of Cloud Atlas, because that is a novel that has a very odd particular structure that the film then more or less blows up, right? The film is kind of told in like
Yeah.
interwoven stories instead of like a nested story structure. And as you were talking about that, it reminded me of the opposite version, which is a movie that I think is much better than the novel it's based on because it messed with the structure in that same way, and that is Return of the King, right? Because
Oh, wow. I thought, never, go ahead. I'll say mine in a minute, but you go.
so, Return of the King is a movie that works. It builds towards a giant crescendo and then it has 17 endings, but we forgive it because it was a great epic crescendo. The book, on the other hand, builds towards an epic crescendo and then goes, hold up, wait a minute. I want to tell you 250 pages of what Sam and Frodo were up to while all of the exciting stuff
Mm.
was happening. And it just destroys all of the pace. And I think that's what I'm appreciating about the television show for the Wheel of Time is that it's doing exactly what you're describing. It's breaking the original down and putting it back together, but it's putting it back together in a way that more closely resembles the original than I would expect given all of the small changes they're making, right? It feels like
Mm.
they're replacing a lot of Legos with other similar Legos, but still building kind of the same general construction. And I think it's working really well, in my opinion.
Yeah, so my example of the better adaptation, I really thought you were going to say this and we were finally in sync, but we're not, is Little Women, which I
Mm,
know you love the Greta Gerwig Little Women. I mean, so
yeah.
if people aren't aware of that adaptation, it's very similar in that the book progresses from when the girls are young to when they're marrying age, essentially,
Mm,
whereas the film intercuts the two halves of the novel. And I
yeah.
think there are some people who find it jarring. I find it absolutely brilliant. And
It
it
works.
opens
Yeah.
up that text in a really different way. And so that to me exactly fits that thing where it's like, yeah, these are there are not that many new scenes added into that Little
Yeah.
Women, but just by changing the order up and inner splicing in that in that case, it's very much even more bold than Return of the King. So
Yeah.
but both are good examples of that. So yeah, and I'm encouraged by what I think given our shtick on this podcast, which is that you're the expert, these texts mean a lot more to you. So to me, as I hear you saying that it works for you, that makes me very excited because
Yeah.
I think your bar would be high, and it both because I know your taste in films is very discriminating, and also because these texts mean a lot to you. I would be worried if it really wasn't working for you.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, I will say I am the eternal optimist about media. I am the person who really loved the fourth Mass Effect game. If anyone is out here like hating Andromeda, I was like, it's great. I love Mass Effect. So don't always take my opinions as ironclad. But I think that we are kind of now at the point where we can say, cool, we talked about the adaptation. Let's now ignore the book entirely and switch our attention to what actually happened on screen in these two episodes of Amazon's The Wheel of Time. I suggest that we take this character by character, kind of look at each of the arcs across the two episodes and what did we think about it. And I kind of want to go from what I'm thinking of as the furthest from the center kind of and work our way towards the middle, kind of the core characters, if you will. So while this seems a little bit odd in TV land, I really feel like kind of the odd character out at the moment is our Moraine and Lan, right? They feel very, kind
Mm.
of disconnected from the rhythm of what is going on in a lot of the other plot lines. I'm suggesting that we start there, even though Moraine has kind of been the de facto protagonist of the television show. I think that her plot line is so distinct from the rest, it makes sense to pull it out. What was your take and what are your kind of impressions of the Moraine and Lan plot line, which I think to some degree it's worth noting is just a lot more deliberate than I was expecting, right? The television show only has 8 episodes a season. I feel like it often pushes the gas very quickly. That is not the case with Moraine carrying water up the stairs.
And I am a sucker for when shows take their time because
Mhm.
I think you're right that, it really feels to me since Game of Thrones, where it's like you got to have all action all the time and
Yeah.
just keep going. Maybe Walking Dead was guilty of that too, but they had some slower paced stuff sometimes before I quit that show because it was too slow paced. So maybe I don't know. But I guess I'll start by saying my biggest surprise in general was that we'd skipped a significant seeming amount of time.
Yeah.
We weren't kind of picking up the pieces right after season one, but we jumped ahead a bit. And it's funny because that in some ways is kind of old school TV, right? Where you
Yeah.
skip the quote unquote summer, but it's all fake in terms of
Yeah.
streaming audiences. But I've been rewatching The Office, and for some reason, the documentary crew takes every May to September off when they're like committed to this paper company. You think they'd stay through the summer when there's normal paper company business. So it's funny that those kind of structures
Yeah.
still come through to streaming when they do. But I did think that it was surprising how long had passed. I then struggled to remember because it had been a while since I'd seen season one. Moraine was kind of fake drummed out of the Aes Sedai, right?
So she was
What?
banished from Tarvalon. And then
Okay.
also at the end of the final episode, the what they were calling at the time the Dark One, although they now realize it was not the Dark One, it was Ishamael, seemed to cut her off from the power. So it's unclear at this point whether she is stilled or simply shielded and not able to break the shield, but she is unable to access the one power, is kind of the big headline, I think, in addition to, as you're saying, her banishment.
And the banishment was arranged with the Amerlin seat to
Correct.
kind of cover her. Okay. So I had that half right. And so it felt, I think you characterized it quite right, which is if there's a bright center to the plot, they're on the planet that it's furthest from. They've
Yep.
been kind of sidelined in this way. And the dominant kind of strand across these two episodes for these two seems to be them working out their stuff with each other and
Yeah.
trying to figure out what it means for Lan to be linked and bonded and devoted to someone who it seems unsure if she will ever channel again, or
Yeah.
certainly if she will count as an Aes Sedai. And I will not. I don't think I'd say that that stuff really worked on me. I think if I had been fresher than I was, that
Mhm.
might have hit more emotionally. Whereas and the other thing is just, again, being a fan of the books, it's like, well, they'll find a way to work it out, right? It's
Yeah.
it's that false danger thing where you're like, well, it'll work out. Which did make the end of their plot line kind of exciting in
Yeah.
that regard. Like, oh, how do you undo that? But broadly speaking, I did like the deliberate pace that you
Yeah.
mentioned, right? I like a show taking its time and not rushing to hit a set of plot points.
Yeah.
And that's a luxury that a lot of these shows don't take. And I think you
Mhm.
said that right. I'm a Better Call Saul over Breaking Bad guy. I know
Yeah.
it's sacrilege, but
I kind of
it's
agree with you, even though I'm only halfway through season 6.
Saul is slow though. And
Yeah.
so a lot of people were like, no. Of course, I think Breaking Bad is slow and people just binged it after the fact,
Yeah.
forgetting how slow it was. But yes. So yeah, give me a Saul, give me an Andor in Star
Mhm.
Wars land. I would take Andor over Ahsoka because I like the very slow pacing and kind of
Yeah.
the slow build. And that works for me. How did you feel about the Lan and Moraine segment of this?
I agree with you that the pace really works. This was the probably in the first episode when it originally dropped, this was the plot line that made me audibly react more than anything else in the
Mm.
entire series. I'm pretty sure the appearance of Bail Domon made me squeal. That was fantastic. Was not expecting it given the way that the plot had gone. And it's worth noting, if you're talking about deliberate kind of pacing, that scene I think is a really good example of it when Moraine is kind of drawing him in and getting him to tell her everything about the Quendiar, and then eventually she kind of slips in, oh, I only want the one gold piece poem rather than the actual valuable thing. I think that scene is a really good example of it. Overall, I think this really works. And the reason it works is because of what you mentioned, right? I finished the first episode of this segment going, I don't know where this Lan and Moraine plot is going. I'm a little bit worried about it.
Mm.
And then at the end of the second, when we get the gut punch of we were never equals, and it's like, ooh, that kind of feels like it should be too serious for it to just be kind of quickly resolved the way I think book readers probably expect it to be. And so it's really kind of exciting to have simultaneously something that feels really earned and true to the characters in terms of this conflict, but also really feel like how are they going to write their way out of this is a question that I think Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are the ultimate examples of shows that just turn that into an art form. And I feel like from at an emotional level, that's kind of where I'm at the end of these two episodes with Moraine and Lan.
I would say that's how I reacted too. Like, never in doubt that they will get reunited, but it is a question of how are you going to do that. A couple other things from this strand I'll note. I really liked the setting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've talked previously about how, in my mind, fantasy is, Northern European villages in the forest. And I
Yeah.
default that way, which is a failing of myself and also fantasy for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, this seeming to me like kind of Mediterranean-ish,
Yeah.
little kind of Spain or Greece kind of Portico style.
Mm-hmm.
And I really liked it, and it was not it immediately set this apart from a lot of other fantasy stories, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you were watching Rings of Power on the same streaming service right beforehand, you're like, oh, this is totally not a place that could be there.
Totally.
I do think Game of Thrones introduced some when they got to the Sand Vipers, some of those kind of
Yeah. Dorne
southern,
and stuff.
yeah. So it's not totally original, but it was really nice to see something different. I'm sure you want to talk about the other people who are at their cottage, though, or their bungalow.
I
Choose
mean,
your word, but
I don't need to talk much about Adelias. She hasn't really shown up other than one paragraph in the books. But Varen, yay. I am very excited that Varen exists in the television show. I've been really impressed by the actress who took her over. I think that is a really difficult role to get right because you never quite know who Varen is. And so you've got to like draw in the audience while still kind of having a lot of that tension around the character. And I think it was towards the end of the second episode. There's a scene where Varen kind of confronts Moraine right before they leave, and I think that was the moment where I was like, okay, even though this doesn't quite look like the Varen that I had kind of imagined in my head, that's Varen. I buy it. I can't tell if she's supporting Moraine or arguing against her in that scene completely, and that's how that character should look on screen.
My first reaction was that I hadn't pictured Varen as that old. You pointed out that this is just poor reading more than anything, which is fair. But you kind of cast in your mind, and
Mhm.
again, I will just confess my own bias. I tend to go white people because
Right.
that's what fantasy has trained me to do, and so it's nice to see a lot of actors and actresses of color. I I guess it I guess it fits the definition of colorblind casting in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. They seem to be like, in this world, we're not going to play games about, skin tones and regions or anything like that, which is great, and it's refreshing. And so to see that carrying on as they fill in some of these new roles works and is
Well,
exciting.
and I think that's one of the really exciting things about adapting Robert Jordan's work is he's literally invented a world where a lot of the things that we experience on a day-to-day life kind of got mushed together by the breaking of the world. And so it makes sense that you get a little bit of everything everywhere. And I remember, again, I think I've mentioned this before. I went to an event where the executive producer of the Wheel of Time television show was talking to some Emerson students. And one of the things that he talked about was how when he went to Amazon, they were really excited about him kind of leaning into the like feminist, diverse side of Wheel of Time, and that at other places might have been an issue. But there they were like, yes, that's what we want from our fantasy series. And like you were saying, just kind of kudos for making that happen, right? I think there's a lot of studios that are still afraid of making diverse content because they think it will only appeal to minority audiences. And let's just prove that wrong once and for all.
Yeah, or you get Disney that, has
Yeah.
troubles because they don't know how to write something, and suddenly they're like, well, the problem was we were too woke,
Yeah.
stealing DeSantis talking points. And I hate that because it's what that meant is you were never serious about it, and that you put the burden on it to immediately perform at a level of everything else when you've trained people to only go to the things of people that
Yeah.
look like them, right? And so yeah, I think the show does deserve credit for that, and I find that exciting. I will just say when I read the book now, I'm definitely picturing these characters,
Yeah.
and I know you said your mind literally doesn't work that way, but my kind of version is like now I'm in flux as we add some of these characters that
Mm,
are appearing for the first time and see them in the book. It's like, a weird kind of mishmash as we go there. But
interesting.
um yeah. Yeah. That's probably all I have to say
Yeah.
about that particular plot line, but always a pleasure to see Rosamund Pike. In
Mm,
between my viewing these two seasons, I saw her in Saltburn, which
yeah.
according to Letterboxd has been the most popular movie for like 2 months. Who knows when we're recording, but it's really good to see her sink her teeth into a really kind of
Yeah.
cheesy role in that film. But here she immediately gets us back in control. She seems like the master. She looks old and tired in a way that I
Hmm.
think actresses aren't often allowed to look old and tired. And it just fits the character so well and where she's at, especially in light of all we just recounted.
Yeah, I have nothing else to add. I think that's a really good note to end on. I think it's just really effectively done by all of the actors in this entire section. Um, we then arrive at the next most inward of the characters. I want to talk a little bit about Nynaeve and her connection primarily in the second episode to Leandrin. This is not a pairing that I would have anticipated being the center of two episodes, but I think it worked really well for me. What was your take on the Nynaeve training sections of these episodes?
So I think when Leandrin first or maybe her second appearance on screen, your wife and former guest of the podcast, Steph, pointed out the devoted online community to Leandrin's jawline. And so every time Leandrin was on screen, I was just like, that is an incredible jawline and
Yeah.
cheekbone structure. Just and so in our room with our dorky but beloved friends, I know they might be listening, we were kind of laughing about how and we want to be clear, this actress is there's a lot of pejoratives that we don't want to say as
Yeah.
pejoratives, but let's go with the pejorative of distinctive looking, right?
Yeah.
Has a face that is not just like actress beautiful, but is one that you haven't seen before, right? And I think
Just to be
that
clear,
is
is
really
beautiful, but yes,
is beautiful, but not in a like,
totally.
oh, there are 20 models who look roughly the same coming down the runway,
Yeah.
like say an Elaine type actress,
Hmm.
for among others. So I found myself like, and this is just pure confessional moment, I guess, like totally captivated by her again, and just like she's such a striking presence in the room. And then that under I guess it doesn't undercut, it supports, it undergirds the actual plot line going on, where it seems like
Yeah.
Nynaeve is kind of sucked into this very charismatic character's kind of web. And to me, that's a striking choice. We know
Hmm.
Nynaeve as a character who struggles with anger and trying to figure out kind of her relationship with Egwene, which has been a large part of our discussions on the main part of the show at different times. I'm not directly linking it, but at
Yeah.
different times. And here we see that playing out across these two episodes, right? They put that Lego brick down, right?
Yeah.
Of like, let's introduce some conflict between these two, some distance, and have them struggle with that a little bit. And into that space, you slide Leandrin
Yeah.
and that incredible facial structure, and it's like, oh, this is much more dangerous than it might have felt at other times because you put those two Lego bricks together.
Absolutely. There's that moment where Nynaeve is training with the warders, and the question that the warders keep asking her is, "Why are you at the White Tower? Like, what brought you here?" And it was really interesting that that scene is, I think, the next time we see Nynaeve after that is the first time that Leandrin starts kind of trying to tempt Nynaeve, and she mentions that she can't train novices, that conversation. And in that conversation, she makes it very clear if you were to ask Leandrin, "Why are you at the White Tower?" her answer is for power. And the question that I have for you is, do you think that that is the pitch that is appealing to Nynaeve, or do you think Leandrin is almost kind of inadvertently winning her over? Like it almost seems like her willingness to be of the Red Aja, but also going to places of healing. Or eventually, at the end of the second episode, we learn that she has much more interaction with men than most Reds ordinarily would. Like those seem more important to Nynaeve's kind of thinking about whether to trust Liandrin or not. And yet it's not really the focus of Liandrin's messaging, right? I guess I'm asking, did Liandrin effectively woo Nynaeve, or did she kind of luck into it?
It's a really interesting question because I have never thought about Nynaeve as seeking power, but she does like anything that keeps her on a step above Egwene and the boys, right?
Yeah.
That she, likes the kind of parental role she had back in Two Rivers, which is what got her to follow along on this quest in the book. It's a little different from the show, as we know. And so to be thinking about this is to her just a way to stay that kind of step above.
Yeah.
But I'm really hesitant to call that power. So to your question, like, is that the play that if somebody was like, Greg, Nynaeve really well, like, how do I win her over? I don't think I'd go play up to her power, right?
Yeah.
Um, there's a little moment where she gets to show her expertise in healing,
Mm-hmm.
and that felt like more the type of ego boost she would need, right? She
Yeah.
wants respect, she wants people to defer to her, but she doesn't, I, I guess I'm fighting with myself about, is that the definition of power? Is that a type of power, or is that
Yeah.
simply, some kind of more ego driven value?
If this were geopolitical, I think we'd be talking about the distinction between hard power and soft power, right? Leandrin is talking about
Mm.
your ability with power to change what others are doing, whereas I think we're describing what Nynaeve wants is the kind of power to make her life what she wants it to be, right? And those are two very different things, even though I think you're right. It takes power to achieve either of those two outcomes. In terms of Nynaeve's plot line, I found it very interesting. Obviously, we're kind of crossing over a little bit with the Egwene Lane section here, but there's a distinct moment where she is kind of tempted by Leandrin, isn't sure what to do, seeks out Egwene, and then immediately afterwards doesn't find Egwene and is kind of sent to go to her test for the accepted. And I thought that that idea of Nynaeve feeling isolated was both a really interesting kind of plot line, and while we're not spending too much time comparing to the book, it's kind of new, interesting wrinkle on the version of the story that we've seen before.
Yes. And I found myself the hesitation in my voice is like, what? How do I word this to stick to our policy as a part of that? Um, you know, I guess I'll word it this way. It had me trying to remember exactly how the final episodes of season one played out,
Yeah.
and there's a gesture here that, and correct me if I got this wrong, that Nynaeve is not actually that powerful. She was just drawing from Egwene's power. Is that how it's described in this episode?
So I think the way that it's described is that between the two of them, they were kind of collectively able to do great things. I think the point that Alana was making was more about them not drawing from anyone but the two of them, rather than it being about like which one of the two of them was more or less powerful, right? I think the story was like Nynaeve plus Egwene was 99% of the power and not the other women who were also involved in the circle. But I think the interesting thing is you're exactly right, is we get this kind of question of hierarchy, right? We know that Egwene
Yeah.
is described as one of the most powerful, but Nynaeve is significantly more powerful than her, although exactly how much, I think you're right, is relatively unclear. And that question of like ordering is something that I think is interesting and being emphasized more than I expected early on in these couple episodes.
Well, and if you can't be stronger, then you want to be more refined, right? And
Right.
essentially that's how I read Nynaeve's choices here. It's like, okay,
Mhm.
I'm not going to be able to to actually overpower her or outpower her, because it's not really overpower, but
Right.
be stronger than her. So instead, what I'm going to do is gain the skills based around it
Yeah.
faster and be better than her, be superior in that way. It's not Hogwarts where there's like House Cup points being tallied somewhere, but it very
Yeah.
much felt like the two honors students really competing to see who can get the 101%
Yeah.
instead of just the 100%. It works for me. We have spent so many book episodes talking about tension between these two characters. It's kind of like, yeah, we just had to find a way to get to that tension
Yeah.
quickly. And I've dodged your question accidentally, but to put Nynaeve in a space where she's isolated is, I think, a dangerous place to put Nynaeve in, because if all she wants is to prove she can take care of other people, then there's nobody to take care of when she's alone.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. This is bringing me to the last point that I had about this plot line, which is also at the very end of the plot line, right? Which is very simply giving Liandrin a son and then making him really old and having her take care of him is a fascinating subplot for this character, right? It is just not at all what I expected. It puts Nynaeve in a really interesting place because of her desire to heal while at the same time trying to figure out what's going on with Liandrin. It puts Liandrin in a really interesting dilemma in terms of wanting to help her son, but everyone in her Aja kind of hating the idea of women interacting with men at all, much less whatever it would take to have a son. Like it's just a out of nowhere shock when you see it for the first time, and I think it works really effectively.
What does it take to have a son? Walk me through biologically. No, yeah, well, and maybe that didn't hit as hard for me as it should have. That maybe the peanut gallery got the best of me at that point. But it is to hear at this point that is who that person was. Maybe did I entirely miss that? I guess I did. Is pretty shocking and pretty hard to reconcile. And you would think somebody in Liandrin's position would do all she can if she had a child to distance herself. So
Yeah.
has this been somebody she's been caring for, or at least keeping intimate contact with for a long time? Or is this somebody who came back in her life? These are answers we don't have, right?
Correct. Yeah, I think all that I am doing is inferring from her repeatedly saying, my boy, my boy, my boy, that my boy means my
Mm,
son.
okay. Interesting. Um, and I like the subtitle for these shows should be Greg thinks very slowly, because I want to stick to our rules. So like every time when you think your podcast has dipped into half speed, it's just me trying to string together thoughts that don't give away anything from the books.
Welcome
I
to my
am
life
in
every week.
I am in the books always very interested in Liandrin and the larger network of relationships Liandrin has. This, as you just noted, represents a very different one,
Mhm.
but one that could essentially be complementary to where she has gone in the books, because if you are going to bend one set of rules, why not bend more sets of rules? We'll
Yeah.
leave it that vague.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good call. And it's a fascinating backstory for a character who at this point is very morally ambiguous to have, right? You're still trying to figure out exactly who Liandrin is. You know that she's been a rival to Moraine. You know that she, as a Red Aja, has some beliefs that are going to be very problematic for Rand and any other man who can channel. But at the same time, like this is just a compelling and interesting kind of character beat. Which I'm excited to see where it goes, and I'm excited for you to see where it goes in the rest of this season. I think we round out the female side of our characters and move along to Egwene and the introduction of Elaine next. What was your take on this plot line? Which I'll be honest, I was expecting to, as I always do, just be like, yay, Egwene's back in my life. She's the best. But I was actually really impressed by the way that the show managed to bring in Elaine and kind of establish her very early on as a dynamic and interesting character. In particular, I thought the scene at the end of I guess I'm jumping all the way to the end of this plot line, but her interaction with Sheriam at the end, where she is like, "No, I'm not telling you, and I'm willing to take whatever punishment you suggest," is just a fantastic character introduction for their first episode. What was your take on? I guess I'm focusing primarily on Elaine, but either of these two characters in these episodes.
I thought Egwene suffered a bit from being an exposition plot line.
Yeah.
In that, like, there's a lot about Tarvalon and the structure of the Aes Sedai hierarchy that needs to be established. So we're just going to do this. And so we were joking in our room that well, this is part of Nynaeve's plot as well, of course, but the first lesson feels like a Hogwarts class. It's
Yeah.
like, let's get all the recognizable students in a room with one teacher who will tell them what to do. And then you expect, Ron to get it wrong, Hermione to get it
Yep.
right away, Harry to blow everybody's mind by doing it completely differently and unexpectedly. And so it kind of felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean I was disinterested. It just felt like it had to do a lot of work to keep the kind of general audience aware of what Aes Sedai powers are. And we established some powers here clearly that I was surprised at them being introduced at this moment, particularly strands and types of strands, as I recall, right?
Yeah, so different kind of the five types of the power. So we're introduced to earth and water in particular in the lesson that you were describing earlier, but there is also fire and air and spirit. And this is all stuff similar to, actually, I think we get a couple of references in this episode or in these episodes to Aes Sedai aging slowly. That is another detail that, like, we're very limited on how much we have as book readers, but we're actually getting it relatively early in the television show. This is a lot of kind of expositional detail. I think you're exactly right. This is, at least in the first episode, this feels like the plot line that is just there to move the pieces around to some degree, and also create a hysterical scene in which Egwene is told how to have a threesome by an Aes Sedai.
And the other comedy scene I liked is I did like when Elaine's like, "Oh, your room hasn't been cleaned yet either," and it was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, right." And like, I do think that it wasn't that Egwene got lost in all that. It just seemed much less about her and her development as much as it was like, let's have her set up. Let's have her be the foil. We're in the year of Phantom Menace, I hope, when this drops, which is the 25th anniversary of that movie. And there's a character in Phantom Menace called Rick Oley, and he's the pilot. And if you listen to only his lines, they are 100% boring exposition, right? Like they get to Coruscant, he's like, the whole planet is one big city, which of course you wouldn't say if you were, say, on a starship of intergalactic people who know the government that they're talking about. But that's all he gets to say. And then he teaches Anakin to fly by saying, like, this one controls the pitch. So it is feeling a little bit like Rick Oley to me, which is unfortunate because Egwene is a character I like a lot more than that. But it's excusable in a couple, especially like you said, especially in the first episode. It's like, yeah, we can do a little of that as long as we give her some good plot and development over the course of the other six, which I trust this show. This show, as we were saying, did a good job of promoting Egwene to make this about her story just as much as the boys. So I don't think they would then just sideline her for this reason.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Egwene is kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of moving things forward in the first episode. And then in the second episode, she's kind of acting in service of both Nynaeve's plot and also the introduction of Elaine. I think you were exactly right to point out it's a really funny scene when Elaine shows up in Egwene's room and is like, "Oh, you just moved in. There's nothing in here." The other one that I thought was really funny is Elaine I assume trying to tactfully say, "I am going to be your queen someday," and settling on "you're my subject," which is not the polite way to say that. I thought that was just a really wonderful introduction to that character who I think we've gotten a little bit of this in the book, but a character who grows up isolated in the palace is just going to be a stuck-up jerk. There is no other way around it. Like, she's a lovely character, but she's learned what she's learned.
In a recent trip through the Sofia Coppola catalog of films, I was introduced to the idea that all of her films are about women in gilded cages,
Yep.
which I really like as an idea, that they are just should be in the lap of luxury because of the kind of privileged life they have, but they are actually imprisoned in this life. And that is kind of what was on my mind for Elaine. And just confirm my memory, we didn't go to Andor at all. They skipped
Correct.
that entirely in the first season of the show. So we haven't met the Queen. We
Yeah.
have had in the books, we've learned about how savvy the Queen is and how tactful and kind of manipulative, not necessarily with a negative connotation she can be.
Yeah.
I don't know what's manipulative when not negative. But I think we're seeing that if that is who the Queen is on the show, then it didn't get passed down.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I had painted Elaine with exactly that brush. I think one of the peanut gallery in the room with us said at first they thought that was Elsie, perhaps, because she was
Mm,
kind of so uncouth. But then obviously they make it very clear it's Elaine very
yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, is that there's this really interesting contrast between Elaine as the character who knows everything and seems like fully informed, and she's literally been in the tower multiple times before. And then there's also the Elaine who really only knows the book learning and has not ever like been out in the real world. And I think that is it's just a compelling kind of starting place for a character. I want to make sure that this doesn't become 2 hours about 2 episodes. Any last thoughts on any of the female characters before we move on to the three boys in our lives in this series?
Sausage party time, dude. Let's do it.
Excellent. Let's start with Matt because he sits in a room and talks to Leandrin a bit and then talks to Min a bit. There's not a ton of meat on those bones, but there is a brand new Matt to talk about. What did you think about the introduction of Donald Finn, I believe is our new actor's name?
I will say what I said when we were watching it, which is, oh, that's the new Matt, right? If you hadn't told me there was a change in actor, I don't think I would have noticed. And that is no disrespect intended to either actor. But when you style somebody up with kind of a lot of
Yep.
facial hair, I kind of identify them more by the pattern of facial hair than I do their facial
Mm-hmm.
features. And so and to your point that he didn't do much, I found myself in the moment trying to ask a lot of questions about which part of which Matt plotline we were in,
Yep.
because I think because of the production circumstances we've talked about where he disappeared for the final 2 episodes of
Correct.
season one. Is that correct? That meant that a lot of the plot I expected to get covered in that time period did not.
Yep.
And it seems like that plot line, I can name it. The plot line with the dagger just seems over, which would be a pretty decent sized shift. It doesn't seem to at all be something they're worried about. So that surprised me. Did I think it was better, worse? Didn't really matter to me. Like you said, there's not a lot going on here.
Yeah.
I think in this set of scenes, I was more excited to be like, oh, sweet, Min's here, and
Yeah.
was more excited to see Min than I was to see Matt. Though I do have questions about how he got here, which they just don't seem concerned with
Yeah.
answering.
At the end of the last season, it kind of almost entirely in voiceover, I think, because they were dealing with the previous Matt actor not being available. Moraine says something along the lines of she sent the Red Aja a letter telling them where to find or how to find Matt. So the presumption is they got that letter and they tracked him down somehow and put him in a place. But I think you're right that this is a plot line that is not especially fleshed out in terms of the why and the how of it. And I think that's kind of the weakness of it, right? I think you're right. I get excited when I see Min because I'm just shocked to see her and I was curious how they were going to work her back in. I'm really excited to see that the new actor for Matt seems to know what he's doing. He gets a couple of decent monologues and nails it as far as I am concerned in these episodes. But more or less, as far as I'm concerned, the only like big thing that we need to dive into is the vision that Min sees of Matt stabbing Rand, which is new and interesting and curious. What are your thoughts on this new prophecy that we have seen kind of no hint of elsewhere in any media?
Well, I will give a bracketed aside and just note I didn't remember seeing Min's visions last season. Is
We
that
did.
correct? Oh, okay. I liked the effect a lot.
Yeah.
So even though I didn't remember it, apparently, I thought it was a good way to represent what we had in the
Mhm.
books. And, there you can immediately understand Min's burden because it's like if
Yeah.
that is happening to you like all the time without you willing it, that's tough, man. That
Yeah.
then you're a tough hang. So uh that then was very surprising to see such a violent vision, and I didn't have the knowledge to be like, that's definitely not something we've seen before, but it felt new to me as well.
Yeah.
I think because of who we're talking about and what we're talking about, I assume it's one of those things like cinematic classic Minority Report, which
I
is
love that movie. You've made that joke like
it is a
twice.
good
That's a
movie.
solid movie.
um Minority Report, in which the spoilers for Minority Report, I guess, but the twist is that if you had a passionate thought about committing a crime, then the precogs would register that as you were going to commit the crime, and you could be arrested by the thought police, blah blah blah. Tom Cruise would come to your house, but it felt a little bit like something like that. Like, I think
Yeah.
we are seeing either he wants to stab Matt, or he, fake stabbing, or sorry, Rand, or
Yep.
he fake stabbing Rand. But I doubt this is actually
Okay.
Matt with a dagger lethally killing Rand. I mean, it was a pretty good stomach stab,
Yeah.
as I recall, which it can all be kind of hinky in fantasy, but tends to be like when it's a gut stabbing, you're gone. Whereas if it's a
Yeah.
shoulder, you're fine. They just want some drama.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This is meant to read as Matt killing Rand, even if we don't know if that's exactly how it's going to play out. And this is one of those big, fun, exciting moments. I think our friend Ben, who is likely to be on the next television episode, he was a guest last season and will be again this season. His response, I want to say, was something along the lines of like, "This is why I like watching the show because I don't know what is like retcon or a change and what is just like a
Mm-hmm.
new take on existing material." And this is exactly what that feels like to me. It's like I think we've probably read a dozen things in the books that might imply Rand and Matt might become at odds at some point, but nothing this explicit. And so now we're all left saying, is it the same as what we've seen before? Is it something that I've seen and you haven't? Is it brand new? I have no idea. That's an exciting place to be. Were there any other moments that stood out for you in the Matt Min plotline other than that vision? Anything else that you wanted to make sure we talked about here?
No, let's talk about Perrin.
All right, let's talk about Perrin.
I was just trying to make your fantasies come true. It's somebody saying to you, no, let's talk about Perrin.
That is what I've always wanted to hear. You are correct. Uh, I think for me, Perrin, number one, is notable, while we're not talking much about this, is notable for being the plot line that is the closest to what happened in a book. Like it at least vaguely resembles things that were on the page. And other than that, I have two main takeaways from the Perrin section. Number one is, yay, Elias is here. Let's figure out what that means and what his role is. We don't get a ton of detail about him in these two episodes, but those of us who have read the books know there's something interesting going on there. And then two, for me as a book reader, we got the weird time loop glimpse into the past and then suddenly room full of flies scene, which is a weird scene to pick out if you haven't read the book. But as a book reader and also as someone who really appreciates like psychological horror, that is just a sequence that has always stood out for me. And I think it worked on screen as much as I was hoping it possibly could.
I'll just agree with you that that scene was really interesting. The presence of Elias surprised me a lot, and
Yeah.
I was excited. We've referenced this before, but most people love the Lord of the Rings movies, but the vocal minority who is more loyal to the books, the name on their tongue is Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
So this would be like if Tom Bombadil had suddenly appeared in Two Towers. Like, oh
Yeah.
wait, like you are gonna pick him up from the first book and pull him in. a part of that. Yes, I can hear you, nerds. Yes, I know Treebeard gets an action sequence in the extended edition that is exactly Tom Bombadil's action and his words. So he's honored, even though he didn't make it into the film. I hear you. I hear you saying that. But to the point at hand, I was really glad to see Elias. I didn't like not having him,
Yeah.
and this group of people, in general, I felt like I was curious about all these people with Perrin, but I was like, I can't tell who's who from the book, so I don't really. I'm just gonna take you all as like white noise. And then I think you're right. The idea that they are on the trail of Padan Fane and that they are seeing this kind of carnage, all pretty straight lifted from the book. Again, sorry for doing that, but it worked, and
Yeah.
it's exciting, and it's thrilling. And thinking again about the adaptation project, then what works better than kind of a kind of chase, right? And
Yeah.
so let's just bring that right in.
Yeah, and I think what works for me in these scenes is that while it is very much about the chase, as you say, most of what we're seeing is the aftermath of the actual kind of chase and what has happened, right? We get burial sequences and we get discussions of what happened in the town, but we don't actually get to see any of the action take place. And that is something that, when it's done well, I think can be much more effective than actually having an action sequence. The perfect example of that for me is the end of the second episode, where we get kind of an extended Shinarans versus Seanchan battle. And it's actually, to me, maybe the least interesting part of the episode, just because it's a bunch of like half naked people who I don't really know swinging swords at each other. It's a lot lower stakes than I think I kind of need my action sequences to often be.
If this was Game of Thrones, they'd be whole naked people. But yeah, well, the part of that surprised me the most, I was like, wait, I want to pause here and flip to my map,
Yeah.
because we are very, very far from where the Seanchan should be. So,
I,
right?
I think the only thing that would contradict that is the fact that like 3 or 4 plot threads ago, we said this is a lot longer from the previous season than we
Mm,
expected it to be. And so I think the story is just they're exactly where they need to be. We just didn't pay any attention to any of the travel they did in the six
okay.
months or however long between seasons. But no, I think you're right. I think it is deliberate in the first and second episode that we don't know exactly where Perrin is, so that even the book readers can be shocked at the fact that the Seanchan show up and go like, "Oh, they're there," right? I think you're right to
Yeah.
be like, it feels like map shenanigans, but I think it's really more timey-wimey shenanigans than map
Mm.
issues.
Point well taken. And so, that makes me think with my modern TV brain.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I'm assuming each season is kind of roughly a book, but you would really want to, in shaping a television season, introduce a conflict that can then get resolved, because you want a season finale
Uh-huh.
to give you some sense of resolution to a set of problems, but then move on, keep you hooked for the next season's worth of problems, broadly speaking, any show. So it seems to me that this makes a lot of sense to episode 2 establish the Seanchan. These are the big bads of this season, and we're going to advance all the little plots along the way until
Yeah.
we can have a big blowout battle with the Seanchan at the end of this season, and then let everybody deal with the aftermath in season 3. So that's me playing Greg the Predictor for just a minute. That seems like, okay, that makes sense to me based on what we know from the books and how they'd want to structure this. I think we're going to build up to a defeat of the Seanchan.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting prediction, and we'll have to see how it goes because we've got 6 more episodes. And we've also got one more plot line, which I don't know what you think, but I know that all of the commentary in the room where we were watching it was about Celine and the actress who plays her, because apparently both of our friends are excited about this plot line. What were your thoughts?
Oh man, is that a good euphemism for it? Yes. It was a little distracting to have a couple chuckleheads at the room fall in love with the evil dark woman. Um, so I think I had at some point maybe when we were doing the first season episodes, I had actually seen the spoiler because it was an accident that they spoiled who was cast as Lanfear slash Celine.
Correct.
Right. It was like one of those cases where the agent posted it on her website before it was officially announced or some
Yeah.
such, which happens in all nerd properties all the time.
Oh yeah.
Agents trying to do their job and yet getting yelled at.
Oh
My
please.
favorite ever was
It's intentional
yeah.
80% of the time. Don't.
My favorite was when Mark Hamill put a picture up of him hanging up his Jedi robe at the end of the Last Jedi shoot, and then Disney forced him to come out and be like, "I'm not hanging it up because I'm done with this role forever. I was done shooting this movie." And blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. Like Luke Skywalker didn't die. Blah 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 blah. So so I was not surprised to see her. I want to know how this does or doesn't remix her origin from the books. Because as I read her here, it's like Rand has traveled and he seems to have just kind of stumbled into her at some point on his travels and made a love connection. We'll call it love. Made an excitement connection. And so the two of them are very much a couple. I mean, the actress seemed fine. Maybe there's sexy stuff to come, but the room was like, God, Cindy Crawford just got here in 1988. I don't know when it was the height of Cindy Crawford's powers. And I was like, oh, okay, fellas. Okay. But
Yeah.
you know, I think it's exciting to see Rand do different things. And I'm just stuck in euphemisms. And so it was a little bit excited to know that he's doing different things. And was I I mean, I think when Rand first appeared on screen, somebody in the room was like, "There's our boy," and it was probably Ben. And I was a little bit of that, like, oh, like it's good to see him again. I'm intrigued by him seeming to be doing community service at a mental hospital. I don't know. I was a little confused by that plot or how that plot might have began. Is he doing this for money or to serve in some way?
So my suspicion is we get a couple of hints throughout the episode that Rand has been getting something out of the people who he has been working with in the mental institution. So at first we see him introduced to someone who is apparently a veteran of the Aiel War, the man who like freaks out when he initially sees Rand because he assumes that he's an Aiel. And we learn that Rand has been learning to fence, to do sword forms from him. And then obviously at the end of the episode, we learn that Rand assaulted the other worker at the mental institution and took his job, which allows him to now interact with Logain. And so I think the presumption would be if he was trying to learn how to use the sword from one person at the institution, that he might then be interested in learning, presumably, how to channel from Logain. So it's this kind of interesting, you're right, it feels like initially something that makes us think like, look at how much Rand has kind of grown and how he's like, doing something good. And then slowly over time, I think our view of how positive this is kind of poisoned throughout the episodes.
I also want to note, I think I have like two fans on the internet. I won't shout you out by name, but I do love you and appreciate you, Greg's fans on the internet, who have joined us on this podcast journey, but also have followed me on my movie podcast, which is the Long Take Review podcast. Find it wherever fine podcasts are. And on that podcast, I mention a film called Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny so often that I have my own sound cue now. Whereas if I bring up Indiana Jones, my co-host Jen, who is awesome, drops in the Indiana Jones theme song, which is an audio eye roll at how often I bring up Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, now available on Blu-ray streaming.
If you bring up that movie more than once in any episode of this show, I will introduce just a sad trombone sound effect whenever you say the name of it.
So I got very excited because the Swordmaster patient plays a small but quite notable role in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. And I immediately turned to the assembled group. I'm like, wait, is that? And you were like, I haven't seen that. And our friend Carl was like, why would I watch that? And Ben was like, what are you talking about? And I couldn't communicate with him who I was talking about without spoiling the movie that
Yeah.
seemingly the rest of you don't care about, but that I still will not spoil for people who don't care about. So, anyway, there's an actor from Indiana Jones in this, and it made me happy.
That's all of the review that I need. We'll see you next time through the glass. No, uh, I think for me, the really exciting thing about this plot line is just the fact that it feels mature, right? I think to some degree, my problem with Rand in the books is that he's 16 and he reads like a 16-year-old, and I don't love being in the head of 16-year-olds. I've done it once. It's not fun. So it's kind of nice to see the Rand and Selene plot playing out kind of very maturely, them getting an opportunity to kind of discuss like their backstories. And we get that really great monologue from Selene about kind of her history with another man and why she's with Rand. And then I think also kind of tied up in that is this kind of institution plot does some really interesting things for how Rand is thinking about his own future, because we know that men who can channel are likely to eventually lose their sanity. And so spending time in a mental institution is a really interesting place for Rand in particular to be operating. And so in a lot of ways, this just feels like the more kind of adult or grown up version of the plots that we've seen kind of similar versions of in the book.
Well, and to that point, I will say the most exciting. I mean, there were a lot of good twists in book in episode 2 that made me excited. But the Logain moment at the end made me very excited and just was totally unexpected due to book content, and so on. I would not have expected either of those people to be here, or I don't guess we don't know definitively where here is, but together in this location does not make a lot of sense to me. So that seems like it holds a lot of promise. The chuckleheads and you in the room were pointing out he's a very good actor. He did great work in season 1 with very little material. I'm thinking of the moment he locks eyes with Matt, I think it was, as they're walking down the street. And it's like, yeah, he didn't get a lot, but he kind of nailed it. Another actor I would say, I don't think, I think he's handsome, but like distinctive looking, right?
Yeah.
And I think those make the great kind of small roles in fantasy, is when you see somebody and you're like, I've never seen somebody who looks like that, and they're striking and they're really interesting. So I'm excited to see where that develops. All in all, I think 2 pretty good episodes of television. Do you have anything else you want to say about these?
No, I think broadly speaking, this is an exciting start. I think the one oddity is that we are very much kind of caught up in the fact that we do 2 episodes per podcast. And that is a little bit odd because Amazon drops 3 episodes as their initial release for this show. So for anyone who does end these episodes thinking that was really good, but it felt a little slow, that is probably intentional. You have now seen 2/3 of what was supposed to be your introduction to this show. The climax of that triad of episodes is yet to come. So we've got some exciting stuff on the horizon. What are you looking forward to as we're preparing to move on to our next television episodes?
Well, I would say that episode 1, A Taste of Solitude, was good. I would say a solid, B for me, and I would bump episode 2, Strangers and Friends, up to a B plus if we're ranking these episodes and showing off that I Googled the titles of the episodes while you were talking a little while ago. So next time we will be talking about episode 3, What Might Be, and episode 4, Daughter of the Night. We hope to have some guests on, as Tyler alluded to before. And we hope that this is kind of a fun and exciting diversion. If we're being completely true, we don't know when we're going to drop these. We just wanted to bank them and make sure they're ready to go. But we're going to commit to this season. Season 3 is happening, but is so vague at this point. We have no idea and aren't going to save them as kind of a build up for those episodes again. So if you are somebody who just found this episode because you somehow liked the show and you liked it enough that you stuck to the very, very end, we should have dropped this at the beginning. Might we recommend Through the Glass Columns, a weekly read along show with fresh episodes? Hey, are you somebody who's just like, I love The Wheel of Time, I haven't read book 3 in a while, I'm going to go back and read The Dragon Rising? Let us join you. You can pick up any episode you want at any time, and we'd be happy to go on a reading journey with you. And we will do so, or we will just be here to continue a viewing journey with you next time through the Glass Columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tyler Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.